Félix Lorioux was easily the equal of any other children's illustrator of his time, and yet outside France he is virtually unknown. He studied at the Paris School of Fine Arts, and in 1910 he was employed by a printing firm specialising in advertising work. After a few years he began looking for work more suited to his talents, and in 1916 he was commissioned by the publishers Hachette to illustrate the book Wonderful Tales. Lorioux's exquisitely rendered watercolour work and eye for detail made this book an instant success, and Hachette eagerly followed up with many more commissions for Lorioux throughout the 20s and 30s. There were too many to feature here, but among them were two separate volumes of the classic fairy tales of Charles Perrault, including Cinderella and Puss in Boots, which were published in 1926. And they were followed in 1929 by Lorioux's illustrated edition of Jean de La Fontaine's Fables, which demonstrated beyond any doubt that Lorieux was the grand master of anthropomorphic animals. These books were immensely popular and sold in unprecedented numbers. It was the quality of his watercolour work which made Lorioux's reputation, and other than his early advertising work at the printers, it isn't easy to find examples of line-only illustration. But there are a handful of chapter headings and spot illustrations, and there are some works in progress showing just how adept his line work was. Lorieux had no interest in self-promotion and chose to maintain as low a public profile as possible, and that may at least partially explain why his success didn't translate to an international level. Later in his career there were Lorieux editions of classics such as Don Quixote and Robinson Crusoe, but he was most at home with his depictions of animals, and arguably created his greatest images in a series of books by writer Bernard Roy. These were known as Les Bouffons des Enfants, and featured a host of enchanting comic depictions of insects, birds and animals for the children's market. And despite the widespread cultural shift towards modernism and less representational imagery, Lorieux managed to keep in work throughout the 40s and the 50s, and died in 1964 at the age of 92. Born in Naples, the son of respected Italian artist Edoardo Matania, Fortunino Matania was a remarkably precocious child. By the age of 14, in 1895, he was having work published in the magazine L'Illustrazione Italiana and featured on their covers and pages up to 1902. In that year, Matania left for Paris, but was almost immediately invited to London to work for the Graphic magazine. In 1904, he was enticed away from the Graphic by a better offer from the Sphere, which had a higher public profile. At the outbreak of the First World War, the magazine sent Matania to make illustrations of the conflict, and although many were rather melodramatic, he was one of very few to give an honest visual account of just how appalling the realities of war could be. Some of these were published in 1916 as a signed collection of lithographs titled With the British Army on the Western Front. Once war had ended, Matania developed a strong reputation for creating historical scenes, many of which appeared in the popular women's magazine Britannia and Eve for the next 2 decades. With the help of human models and statues for reference, he began to paint all manner of historical work, all with the same remarkable attention to detail and a fondness for exposed female flesh he was lucky to get away with at the time. Like virtually every realist painter, Matania used oil paint and did so with remarkable skill and precision. He was also astonishingly controlled with his pen line work, although there isn't a huge amount of that to be found. And most of his monochromes are tonal gouache paintings over pencil sketches. In 1933, Matania applied his visual credibility to Edgar Rice Burroughs' science fiction stories Pirates of Venus and Lost on Venus. And from the 30s onward, his talents made him a popular illustrator for advertising, particularly a series of tourism posters for the resorts Southport and Blackpool. But Matania's first love would always be historical painting, and in his later career he illustrated features for the educational weekly Look and Learn, and was still working on the series at the time of his death in 1963. American illustrator, graphic designer and artist Edward McKnight Kauffer was born in Montana, but in 1910, at the age of 20, he moved to San Francisco and studied at the California School of Design for 2 years. He followed this with 6 months at the Art Institute of Chicago, before heading for Paris and the Académie Moderne. Initially planning a career as an artist, Kauffer moved to London at the start of the First World War, but could achieve no more than limited success and struggled to find a visual identity he could call his own. But when it came to illustration, by 1915 he was doing far better with his poster work for London Underground. And the style-hopping versatility that had undermined his art was to prove a real asset in his commercial work. This success led to even more transport work, and he created around 140 posters spanning many styles, including Futurism and Cubism, while other pieces showed more post-impressionistic and Japanese influence. At that time, Britain and the rest of Europe were far more receptive to modernist principles than the States, and it's highly unlikely McKnight Kauffer's abstracted images would have got him far in his own more conservative country. Kauffer's output was by no means confined to transport, and in addition to several high-profile ad campaigns in the 30s and 40s, including one for Shell Oil, he also had great success with quite a few book jacket designs, and in some cases illustrated the interior pages. Like many of his generation, Kauffer saw no real difference between art, illustration and design. And as if he felt the need to demonstrate even greater versatility, Kauffer also designed daringly modern stage sets for the theatre. He visited New York in 1940 to look for even more work from the advertising agencies of Madison Avenue. This was not a particular success, as you might expect, but in 1947 American Airlines did commission him for a series of posters promoting their destinations. And with them and several other dependable clients, McKnight Kauffer stayed pretty much at the top of his profession until his death in 1954. And like Matania, John LaGazza was also born in Naples, but his mother died when he was only 4, and his father took him to live in the United States. At the age of 15, he enrolled in the New York School of Art in 1909. LaGazza was already selling drawings to Life magazine to pay for his education, and once he had graduated he carried on this professional association. In the early years there was an obvious influence from the Coles Phillips Fadeaway Girl, but before long he had found his own more naturalistic identity. He was also creating illustrations for NWA, a major advertising agency, and that soon converted into full-time employment when he was in his 20s. During this period he was creating all manner of illustrative work for a diverse list of mainstream clients, but he was becoming increasingly frustrated, and rashly he resigned and spent 6 months creating a new portfolio, almost exclusively of female figures modelled by his wife. But the gamble paid off, and he was immediately inundated with commissions for similar work, and the advertising work now was aimed almost exclusively at the female market. And there were magazines including Ladies' Home Journal, Cosmopolitan, McCall's and Harper's Bazaar. He created a total of 22 covers for the Saturday Evening Post alone. During the 1930s, when the average income was around $3,000 a year, LaGazza earned over $100,000. And with that income, the LaGazzas lived in style with numerous homes, servants, and a 45-foot yacht. When the stock market crashed, LaGazza was unscathed, as he had wisely invested his money in real estate. He was disdainful of photography and worked from live models almost exclusively on illustration board, drawing with charcoal. He then sprayed the drawing with fixative and overpainted with thin oil paint, which allowed the charcoal lines to show through. He often finished a painting by adding colour using a palette knife to build texture. But he was also quite happy to work in gouache and watercolour when the mood took him. LaGazza was easily one of America's most successful illustrators, but in the later 1940s his clients began to desert him as magazines and advertisers gravitated towards photography. He sold up his properties and moved to California, and did continue with some advertising work for clients such as Woodbury Soap and La Rosse Lingerie, but the income was nowhere near what it had been. And by the late 50s he had drifted to obscurity and died in 1977. Takeo Takei is among Japan's most influential children's illustrators of the 20th century, but outside Japan he's a well-kept secret. Takeo showed artistic promise from an early age and attended the Tokyo Art School, graduating in 1919. It took him a couple of years to get established, but in 1922 Takeo's artwork was used on the first cover of the groundbreaking children's magazine Komodo no Kuni, which translates as Children's Land. And in the decade that followed, Takeo's delightfully strange images featured on many more of their covers. His output was prodigious in the 1920s. He wrote and illustrated his own stories, as well as Japanese folk tales and original stories by other writers. In 1925, he produced a particularly idiosyncratic and individualistic visual interpretation of Aesop's fables. In 1926, Takeo published one of the most successful picture books, King Ramu Ramu, and he followed up this success in 1928 with the equally peculiar and compelling The Animal Village. And in that same year he published an illustrated Tales of Hans Christian Andersen. And just like Aesop's fables, these stories provided him with the opportunity to produce some truly remarkable images, as Eastern and Western cultures collided with remarkably distinctive creative energy. Takeo was one of the first illustrators anywhere to create illustrations for children, with the guiding principle that stimulating the child's imagination was the primary objective, and that strict representation was simply not necessary. Takeo had an eclectic approach to his use of media. He most commonly used combinations of watercolour, crayon, pen and ink in varying proportions. But there was also more graphic use of flat colour to be seen, and he deployed his considerable skills with woodblock printing techniques in both his illustration and his art. Sadly, most of Takeo's original illustration artwork was destroyed by fire in Tokyo during World War II, but at least we have a large amount of printed material to testify to his genius. In later life, Takeo gravitated increasingly towards printmaking, and his highly distinctive work in that area became particularly sought after by collectors. This abstracted print technique was also used to distinctly weird effect in his limited edition alphabet book. Takeo died in 1983 and should be far more widely remembered as a pioneer of modernism in children's books. Maybe this will get him a little better known outside Japan.